Hi, I'm Mikhail Kosiborod, cardiologist at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute in Kansas City. And joining me today are Eric Peterson, John Spertus, my good friends, and we are all at American Heart Association Quality of Care and Outcomes Research Conference in Washington, D.C. And one of the sessions that we're going to do late this afternoon actually is on really important topics, which include real-world evidence and open science. And these are perhaps the terms that have been kind of punted around quite a bit and sometimes cause a bit of confusion among various people, including clinicians, sometimes really trying to understand what these terms mean. And real-world evidence in particular, I think, has been kind of in vogue recently, generating a lot of buzz in terms of some of the comparative effectiveness studies, and the questions even being raised whether real-world evidence in some way is going to replace, at least in some way, shape, or form, some of the more expensive clinical science that we generate, such as large outcome studies. And I think that may be a bit premature, but certainly evidence from real-world studies has been taking a bit more of a center stage recently. And Eric, I'm going to ask you, what are your thoughts on how much of this you think is justified, how much of this may be a bit premature, and more importantly, what do you think is going to go from regulatory standpoint in particular, as well as how this evidence is viewed by the payers, which is, of course, in the U.S. healthcare system is of critical importance.
Sure. Thank you, Mikhail, and thank you for inviting me to this session, a very important session at QCOR this year. I think my short answer is it depends in part on the question. As you very well know, the evidence that's generated in routine clinical practice is in part best to answer a lot of questions. How is current contemporary care given? Where are there quality gaps and concerns? Issues of cost, issues of utilization, and as John will talk about, the patient experience. So for those perspectives, obviously, quote unquote, real world evidence, or RWI or E, is going to be sort of the best evidence for those questions. If we're really trying to tell if treatment A is better than treatment B under a given protocol, then obviously randomization will still trump that.
What are your thoughts on specific? So one of the arguments that's being used sometimes for RWE is that there are certain groups of patients that just never get included in clinical trials. That's a way to look at that. Do you think that's legitimate?
Right, and I think, as we'll probably talk about this afternoon, in my mind, this is a spectrum, and in the ideal world, it isn't, an A or a B, but in fact, you get to the pragmatic clinical research projects that would enroll patients, a much more generalizable population that's representative of those who will actually be treated. But to the extent possible, you inject randomization to assure balances between the two treatment arms.
And I guess that's a point to make is that, sometimes we look at these things dichotomously, one versus the other. There is also, of course, many of these sources of evidence are complementary to one another. So clinical trials, RWE, frequently can point clinicians in the right direction, particularly when the results are congruent. Obviously, we have situations where that's not always the case. John, what are your thoughts on PROs? So PROs, of course, are also taking patient-reported outcomes, are taking more of a center stage, not only from a standpoint of clinical research, but also clinical practice, and also from a regulator standpoint, potentially being looked at as a valid outcome that may in fact get indications in certain situations. What are your thoughts and experience with using PROs, and where do you think this is going in the future? And in particular, what do you think patient-reported outcomes, what kind of role do you think they can play in real-world and pragmatic studies versus traditional randomized clinical trials?
So I really agree with what you both are saying, is that there's a real synergy between randomized clinical trials and set protocols versus real-world evidence, which extends the population, but also sort of says, does this really work in a more usual care setting? And since most patients receiving those treatments are receiving them in a usual care setting, it's really very important information to supplement the clinical trials. In randomized clinical trials, we have recently been seeing a growing interest and surge of enthusiasm in really understanding, for the vast majority of patients who don't die, how are they actually doing? What are their symptoms, their function, their quality of life? And the FDA is really starting to express much more interest. The 21st Century Cures Act really propelled this, and they are now trying to identify how to certify certain PROs, patient-reported outcome measures, and how to weigh them in deciding whether to approve therapies or not. So, what's going to happen, I believe, is there's going to be an increasing need for real-world evidence to start to capture routinely patient-reported outcome measures. And I think there are other movements happening in the field of medicine that are also going to accelerate the inclusion of formal PRO assessments into healthcare. This includes efforts by Medicare and the National Quality Forum and others to create PRO-based performance measures of quality, because ultimately the better care we're giving to patients, the better they should be doing. And so it's a very important step forward in trying to assess the quality of care we provide. I also think that the growth in technology and mobile platforms, the ability of EMRs to start to pull in patient-reported outcomes and integrate it into clinical workflow can actually improve the doctor-patient communication, the efficiency of a visit, and the opportunity to recognize that patients aren't maybe doing as well with their current treatment, and we ought to be thinking about more advanced therapies. And as there is a greater demand and inclusion of PROs in the process of delivering routine clinical care, then that evidence becomes available for real-world evidence and comparative effectiveness studies and implementation research to really understand the impact of something being studied in a pragmatic clinical trial on what I think many patients would say is the most important thing, how they're feeling and how they're doing.
And then, the second issue that we're going to address in the session as well is this idea of open science. So, Eric, what is open science? I mean, I think there is sometimes a little bit of confusion what the term means, and maybe you can just briefly define what we usually mean when we say that term.
In short, open science just means sharing your data. It's a funny thing, and most people would believe that the evidence that they're sort of generating, if they're a subject within a study or if their records are being used, is to promote science in its broadest sense. But in essence, often that information is used for a given single trial whose access to that data is limited to a small group of executives who sort of run the study. In an ideal world, everybody who could potentially use that data to answer important questions and make scientific advances should have access to it, and that's the concept behind data sharing. Years ago, not too many years ago, we thought that this is sort of how it always would be. The data would be controlled by those who ran the study, and no one else would ever get access unless you were their friends. As we move forward in time, groups like the FDA, the Institute of Medicine, now the major journals, even the European regulatory societies are more and more requiring the idea that, in fact, people who conduct a clinical trial or even sometimes observational studies would allow that data to be open and accessed by others to answer questions under controlled circumstances. The key things are, in part, protecting the privacy of the patient first and foremost. Secondly, we need to give credit to the data originators. It goes a lot of work when John or yourself carry out a clinical trial or a large registry. How do you make sure that the individual who put that effort in is actually rewarded somehow in this process? And then thirdly is you need to make it available. John has already talked about the importance of platforms and technologies that will allow the collection of PROs. It's very similar that you need to have a platform that allows you to access the data and be able to understand how to run your query in a safe environment that protects patient confidentiality.
And just briefly, do you think, so of course the big promise of open science was that it's going to dramatically increase the number of questions that are being asked and answered, and both academic productivity, but more importantly, important clinical questions being answered for the patients and moving science forward. And it's probably a little too premature and too early right now to really say whether that's panning out, but what's your sense so far? Do you think that promise is being fulfilled?
Yeah, I think the answer, I'm a little worried when you give the was term. I think it's still, we're in the early infancy stage of this. And much like any field, it takes years between the time for which there's the capacity and potential to the time that that potential is actually realized. In this case, we hope this speeds up, but I think ultimately, like all aspects of society, the more and more data is opened as the world becomes flatter, Thomas Friedman line, the world actually becomes more available to do this kind of stuff. So to date, the answer is no, it hasn't been realized. Tomorrow, I'm hopeful that it'll be better.
Sounds great. Well, as you can see, this is a session that's really going to touch on some critically important issues in clinical research, clinical science, but also very much applicable to clinical practice, to payers, regulators, really to society at large. So once again, we are here at the Quality of Care and Outcomes Research American Heart Association meeting today. And very much appreciate Eric's and John's help, and look forward to the session.